On August 10, 1680, the Pueblo people rose against Spanish colonizers in one of the most significant uprisings in Native American history. For decades, the Pueblo people endured brutal oppression, forced labor, starvation, land seizure, and relentless persecution for practicing their sacred traditions. Despite their larger population, the Puebloans faced a formidable enemy. The Spanish possessed firearms, steel armor, and swords, far superior to the Puebloans' bows, arrows, and stone weapons. The imbalance of power was stark, and survival seemed impossible. Repeated negotiations with the Spaniards only brought more suffering. The Pueblo leaders realized that fighting wasn't a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. Each Pueblo village was an independent nation, divided by language and customs. They had never united before. But facing a shared enemy, they set aside their differences and came together as one. To understand the magnitude of this historic uprising, we must go back 140 years, to when the Spanish first arrived on Pueblo lands. In 1540, Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition into the Puebloan lands, driven by greed for gold, silver, and precious resources. The Spanish crown promised unimaginable wealth, fueling a relentless search for riches and land for forced labor, a brutal system already well established in Spanish-controlled Mexico. Coronado's army of 2,000 men included hardened Spanish soldiers and native allies coerced into fighting. Their first target was the Zuni village of Yahuecu. Having heard of the Spanish conquests in Mexico, the Zuni people acted swiftly, relocating their women, children, and elders to the Mesotop Sanctuary, a remote, defensible location. But even with such preparations, Zuni warriors faced an overwhelming force. The Spaniards came armed with steel swords, guns, and deadly war horses. Technological advantages the Zuni couldn't match. They fought fiercely, but were ultimately outnumbered and outgunned. This first brutal clash marked the beginning of a long and bloody struggle between the Puebloan tribes and the Spanish invaders, a struggle where survival meant resisting at all costs. After capturing the Zuni village, the Spaniards found no gold, only shattered hopes. Frustrated but determined, they pushed further into Pueblo lands. Representatives from Pecos Pueblo soon approached them with a proposition. They offered to guide the Spaniards eastward to rival tribes known for conducting raids. To the Pecos, sending the Spaniards away seemed like a chance to remove a dangerous threat. But the Spaniards brought more than just violence. They carried valuable trade goods like horses, sheep, and steel tools. These items, while useful, came at a heavy price. As Coronado's forces journeyed through the Rio Grande Valley, they encountered the Tewa communities farming its fertile floodplains. Desperately low on supplies after exhausting what they had seized from the Zuni, the Spaniards saw the Tewa as a lifeline. Coronado made a cold calculation. The Tewa's survival would be sacrificed for the Spaniards' survival. He ordered his men to establish a winter encampment, setting the stage for a brutal chapter in Pueblo history. Determined to establish control, the Spaniards drove the Tewa people out of Pueblo and turned it into a military base. Archaeological evidence reveals fierce battles took place as the Tewa fought desperately to defend their homeland. But faced with the Spaniards' superior firepower, the Tewa, Caris, and Tewa Pueblos were forced into a brutal choice: comply or perish. At first, the Pueblos traded food and supplies to avoid further bloodshed, but winter loomed, and they could not afford to continue. When the exchanges stopped, Coronado ordered his men to take what they needed by force, leaving the Pueblo people to face hunger and freezing temperatures. The Spaniards' cruelty knew no bounds. They assaulted women, pillaged homes, and burned entire villages. The Tewa struck back, killing Spanish horses and mules in an act of defiance. Enraged, Coronado unleashed a savage attack on the nearby village of Arenal, killing every warrior and burning 30 men alive at the stake. Desperate and outnumbered, the Tewa fled to a mesotop fortress, a natural stronghold. But Coronado was relentless. His forces laid siege from January to March 1541, waiting until starvation and thirst broke the Tewa's spirit. When they finally tried to escape, the Spaniards were waiting. The fate of the captured Tewa was brutal, a grim reminder of the price of resistance in the face of imperial conquest. But even in defeat, their rebellion echoed through history. The aftermath of the Pueblo resistance was devastating. The Spaniards killed all the men and most of the women from the captured villages. Those women who survived were enslaved and forced into brutal labor. Coronado's forces departed later that year, but their cruelty left deep scars on Puebloan lands and spirits. However, the Spanish thirst for conquest was far from over. In 1598, Juan de Oñate, a ruthless conquistador, returned with a mission to establish permanent Spanish control. He divided Pueblo lands into 7 provinces, assigning Catholic priests to each region. These priests were charged with converting native people to Christianity through violent coercion, taxation, and forced labor, a system designed to break the Puebloans' cultural identity. While a few priests allowed limited cultural practices, most declared Pueblo traditions heretical. They destroyed kivas, the sacred underground chambers central to Puebloan religious and social life, and banned spiritual ceremonies. Sacred objects were confiscated, and resistance to conversion often meant execution or enslavement. Under constant Spanish demands for tribute and labor, the Puebloans found themselves trapped in a cycle of survival, oppression, and rebellion. They struggled to endure harsh winters while meeting impossible quotas. But despite the Spaniards' relentless cruelty, their faith, culture, and spirit endured, waiting for the moment when rebellion would rise again. Faced with relentless oppression, the Pueblo tribes frequently rose up against the Spaniards, despite lacking sufficient warriors and advanced weapons. These rebellions were often crushed before they could gain momentum, with the Spanish killing resistors or selling them into slavery. By 1598, tensions reached a breaking point. Acoma Pueblo, a mountain fortress, refused to pay food tribute demanded by the Spaniards. Their leader Zutacapan anticipated violent retaliation, but his people were determined to resist. Aware of the Spaniards' merciless treatment toward those who defied them, Zutacapan attempted diplomatic negotiations. But when 17 Spaniards arrived at Acoma demanding food, the Puebloans stood their ground and refused. Frustrated and angry, the Spaniards assaulted Acoma women. A fierce fight broke out, leaving 12 Spaniards dead. When news of the clash reached Oñate, he ordered a full-scale attack, sending 70 well-armed soldiers to crush the Acoma resistance. In January 1599, the Spanish arrived in force. Out of an estimated 6,000 inhabitants of Acoma Pueblo, 2,000 were warriors. Despite their fierce resistance, the Spaniards stormed the fortress after 3 days of intense battle, using cannons to break Acoma's stone defenses. The aftermath was horrific. 500 warriors were killed alongside 300 women and children. The surviving 500 Puebloans faced unspeakable punishments. Men over 25, right foot amputated and enslaved for 20 years. Boys aged 12 to 25 and women over 12, enslaved for 20 years. The 60 youngest women were sent to Mexico City as slaves. To send a chilling warning to neighboring tribes, the Spaniards cut off one hand of 2 Hopi men and released them as living symbols of the cost of defiance. Even the Spanish King Philip III was shocked by the extreme brutality. In 1606, Juan de Oñate was banished from New Mexico and later recalled to Spain for his cruelty. Despite his fall from power, the legacy of destruction he left behind haunted the Pueblo people. But their spirit of resistance endured, laying the foundation for future uprisings, including the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The Acoma massacre left the surrounding Pueblo tribes in shock and fear. News of the Spaniards' brutality spread rapidly, despite the tribes' cultural and linguistic differences. However, even after Juan de Oñate's removal, nothing improved. Spanish Catholic missionaries intensified efforts to eradicate Pueblo culture. They dictated how people should worship, marry, work, and live, all according to European customs. Traditional Pueblo ceremonies were outlawed, and priests destroyed kivas, the sacred ceremonial chambers central to Pueblo spirituality. One of the few officials who tried to ease this repression was Governor Bernardo López de Mendizámo. Serving from 1659 to 1660, he limited the priests' power, forbidding them from forcing the Puebloans into unpaid labor and recognizing their right to perform sacred dances and rituals. But his reforms were short-lived. The Spanish Inquisition charged him with heresy and convicted him on 33 counts of misconduct, falsely accusing him of practicing Judaism. With his removal, the priests resumed their reign of religious intolerance. plunging the Pueblo world deeper into suffering. By the 1660s and 1670s, drought and searing heat turned the Pueblo lands into a barren wasteland. With crops failing and food supplies dwindling, entire communities faced starvation. The Apache, Navajo, and Comanche tribes, driven by hunger, raided the Pueblos for what little they had left. When the raiders found no food, they kidnapped men, women, and children, selling them into slavery for provisions. Even when harvests succeeded, the Spaniards seized everything, leaving the Puebloans to starve through the winter. Surrounded by enemies on all sides, the Spaniards' oppression on one side and raiding tribes on the other, the Puebloans endured unimaginable hardship. But even in the darkest times, hope survived. The seeds of resistance had taken root, waiting for the right moment to rise up and reclaim their freedom. That moment would come in 1680. By the late 1600s, the Pueblo people had reached a breaking point. Their population, once estimated at 40,000 to 80,000, had dwindled to around 15,000 due to war, forced labor, famine, and European diseases. Adding to their misery was a prolonged drought, which the Puebloans believed was a result of the forbidden suppression of their spiritual practices. In 1675, Spanish governor Juan Francisco Trevino ordered the arrest of 47 Pueblo medicine men, accusing them of plotting rebellion. 4 were sentenced to death, 3 were hanged, and the 4th took his own life rather than face Spanish cruelty. The remaining prisoners were whipped and enslaved. Outraged, 70 Pueblo warriors surrounded the governor's office in Santa Fe, demanding the release of their religious leaders. Trevino, facing Apache and Navajo raids that stretched his military thin, reluctantly agreed. One of the released leaders was Popay, a Tewa medicine man from San Juan Pueblo. Popay's early life remains mysterious, but historians estimate he was born around 1630, witnessing decades of oppression and suffering. He was known as a fierce and visionary leader whose presence inspired both respect and fear. After his release, Popay retreated to the isolated Taos Pueblo, famous for its unyielding resistance to Spanish rule. From there, he began planning a rebellion with a singular goal: to expel the Spaniards, destroy their influence, and restore Pueblo traditions. Over the next 5 years, Popay traveled in secret to 45 Pueblos, forging alliances with leaders despite cultural and language barriers. His efforts were unprecedented in Pueblo history. He even killed his son-in-law, Nicolas Bua, suspecting he might betray the cause. Remarkably, Popay also managed to gain support from the Apache and Navajo tribes, traditional enemies of the Pueblos, though the extent of their involvement remains unclear. The northern Tewa, Towa, Tano, and Caris-speaking Pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley united behind Popay's vision, laying the foundation for one of the greatest Native American revolts in history. A storm of rebellion was coming, and Popay was its fierce and determined architect. By 1680, after enduring over a century of Spanish occupation, the Pueblo tribes were ready to rise. Despite cultural and linguistic differences, they now shared a common language, Spanish, and an even deeper shared hatred for their oppressors. However, not every Pueblo joined the rebellion. Pecos Pueblo, located 50 miles east of the Rio Grande, along with the distant Zuni and Hopi tribes, pledged their support. But 4 southern Tewa towns near Santa Fe and the Piro Pueblos near present-day Socorro refused to join, having grown too dependent on Spanish protection and trade. Popay knew better than to trust them. He kept his plans secret, relying only on the most trusted allies. From Taos Pueblo, his base of operations, he coordinated the uprising with military precision. The date was set, August 11, 1680. Popay sent runners to every Pueblo with knotted cords. Each Pueblo leader was instructed to untie 1 knot each day. When the final knot was undone, the rebellion would begin. The orders were clear: burn the churches, kill the priests, expel or kill all Spaniards. The plan was to wipe out the isolated Spanish settlements first and then converge on Santa Fe, dealing the final blow. However, just before the scheduled uprising, Southern Tewa leaders betrayed the plan. The Spaniards intercepted 2 runners on August 9, 1680, and tortured them until they revealed the meaning of the knotted cords. The Spaniards quickly realized the extent of the threat, but they were gravely outnumbered. Their population of 2,400 was scattered across vast territories, leaving only 170 soldiers in Santa Fe, their last defensible stronghold. Realizing that the element of surprise was lost, Popay immediately dispatched new runners with orders to start the rebellion a day early. Though the plan was compromised, the fire of resistance was already burning. The Pueblo revolt of 1680 was about to explode with a ferocity the Spanish never expected. Despite Popay's efforts to send new orders, the Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi Pueblos, located far from Taos, never received the updated instructions. Unaware of the early start, they rose up one day late on August 11, 1680. But even delayed, they struck with strategic brilliance, stealing Spanish horses and sealing off key roads leading to Santa Fe, cutting off the Spaniards' chances of escape or reinforcements. Meanwhile, on August 10th, the Tewa, Carasan-speaking Pueblos, and even the Apache tribes launched a simultaneous, coordinated attack on Spanish settlements throughout New Mexico. By August 13, 1680, every major Spanish settlement in the province had fallen to Pueblo forces. The Spaniards were overwhelmed, and survivors were forced to retreat towards Santa Fe. Governor Antonio de Otermin gathered the remaining colonists and prepared to defend the capital with the 170 soldiers he had left. As 2,500 Pueblo warriors converged on Santa Fe, nearly 1,000 Spanish refugees crammed into the governor's palace, seeking protection. But food supplies dwindled, and water ran out. The siege was relentless. At the same time, another group of over 1,000 Spanish survivors from Rio Abajo, led by Lieutenant Governor Alonso Garcia, had gathered at Isleta Pueblo, 70 miles south of Santa Fe. However, neither group was aware of the other's location, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. On August 21st, driven by desperation, Governor Otermin launched a final counterattack. His forces broke out of the governor's palace, launching a fierce assault on the Pueblo warriors. Though the Spanish managed to push back the attackers, it came at a high cost in lives. The retreat to the south was now their only option. The survivors from Santa Fe began a grueling march southward toward safety. Along the way, they finally linked up with the group from Isleta Pueblo. After briefly regrouping in Socorro, the entire caravan of refugees resumed their harrowing journey toward El Paso del Norte. The Pueblo warriors tracked the Spanish survivors the entire way, shadowing them but never attacking. The Spaniards reached El Paso on September 27, 1680, ending one of the most remarkable retreats in colonial history. The Pueblo revolt of 1680 had shattered Spanish rule in the region. The Spaniards lost over 400 colonists, including 21 out of 33 Catholic priests, while the Pueblos paid a heavy price in lives as well. But for the first time in over 100 years, the Pueblo people were free from Spanish control, a stunning victory that stood as the most successful Native American uprising in the history of North America. Their land, culture, and identity had been reclaimed, if only for a time. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 dealt a crippling blow to the Spanish Empire, costing the lives of 400 Spaniards, including 21 of 33 Catholic priests. Yet 2,000 Spanish survivors escaped, retreating south to El Paso del Norte. In the immediate aftermath, Popay emerged as the undisputed leader of the newly liberated Pueblo Alliance. Together with Alonso Catiti and Luis Tupatu, he traveled from village to village, restoring Pueblo traditions and erasing every symbol of Spanish rule. Under Popay's command, the Pueblos rebuilt their sacred kivas, destroyed crosses and churches, and burned Christian relics. He declared, Popay's orders were strict and uncompromising, aiming to purge every trace of colonial influence. But many Puebloans resented his iron-fisted rule. Some had converted to Christianity or had Spanish relatives they did not want to abandon. The Pueblo tribes, long accustomed to independent rule, rejected Popay's authoritarian leadership. By 1682, he was deposed but later re-elected shortly before his death in 1688. With Popay gone, the Pueblo Confederation disintegrated and internal divisions returned. For 12 years, the Pueblos successfully held off Spanish forces, defeating attempts to reclaim New Mexico in 1681 and 1687. But relentless drought, crop failures, and famine ravaged the Pueblo tribes, leaving them weakened and isolated. Without Spanish protection, the Pueblos became targets of frequent raids by Apache, Navajo, and Comanche warriors, pushing them into a constant struggle for survival. Though Spanish rule eventually returned, the Pueblo revolt forever reshaped the relationship between colonizers and native peoples. The Pueblos had shown that freedom was possible, if only for a moment. Their legacy of resistance would be remembered for generations to come. Popay's spirit endured. His fight for liberation became a lasting symbol of native resilience. By 1692, the Spanish crown was determined to reclaim New Mexico, and the task fell to General Diego de Vargas, appointed as governor of New Mexico. His mission was to restore Spanish control while avoiding the costly failures of earlier attempts. In August 1692, Vargas marched into Santa Fe without resistance. Expecting a fierce battle at Pecos Pueblo, he was shocked when the Pecos people welcomed him instead. In a surprising twist, Pecos even offered 140 warriors to help retake Santa Fe. Vargas's small army included 60 Spanish soldiers, 100 native auxiliaries, 7 cannons, and 1 Franciscan priest. When he reached Santa Fe in September, he negotiated with 1,000 Puebloans, promising protection in exchange for allegiance to the King of Spain. After several tense days, the Pueblo leaders reluctantly agreed, recognizing that Spanish rule, now softened by the memory of prior brutality, was no longer the worst threat compared to Apache and Navajo raids. Vargas spent the following months traveling from Pueblo to Pueblo, reasserting Spanish rule. Though he occasionally encountered resistance, many communities accepted his terms, viewing the Spanish as a buffer against other tribal enemies like the Comanche and Apache. Despite initial cooperation, tensions reignited. By the early 1690s, Vargas imposed stricter control, determined to fully secure New Mexico. In 1693, he returned to Santa Fe, only to find 70 Pueblo warriors and 400 of their family members blocking his path. Refusing to retreat, Vargas ordered an attack, securing a swift but brutal victory. He executed the warriors and enslaved their families for 10 years. His harsh tactics sparked another revolt in 1696, led by 14 Pueblo communities. The rebels killed 5 missionaries and 34 settlers, but their rebellion was quickly crushed by Vargas's forces. Faced with relentless Spanish retaliation, many Puebloans fled west to join Apache and Navajo bands. However, the remote Hopi tribes resisted any attempts at reconquest, remaining free from Spanish rule despite several failed campaigns to force their surrender. For them, and for many Pueblo communities, the 1680 revolt had permanently weakened Spanish control. Though Pueblo independence lasted only 12 years, its impact was profound. The Spanish, having learned from the revolt, ended forced labor, abolished tributes, and even granted land to Pueblo communities. They also appointed legal defenders to represent the Puebloans in Spanish courts, an unprecedented policy at the time. Even the Catholic priests adopted a more tolerant approach, permitting traditional Pueblo spiritual practices while encouraging religious coexistence. The revolt helped preserve Pueblo culture, languages, and customs, a legacy still alive today. In a final historical irony, Pueblo warriors and Spanish soldiers would later fight side by side, defending their lands against common enemies like the Apache, Navajo, and Comanche. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 remains a powerful symbol of native resistance, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, freedom and identity are worth fighting for. Their legacy endures, etched into the history of North America.